There are sentences you never forget. Not because of how loud they were, but because of how calm the person was when they said them. Leave, and never come back. That's what my mother said to my 7-year-old son. At the dinner table. On Christmas Eve. While the candles were still burning and the turkey hadn't even been cut. I want you to imagine that for a second. A little boy, in his best sweater, the one with a reindeer on it that he begged me to buy him. Sitting up straight because his grandmother told him, "Good boys sit up straight." Smiling, because he thought this was going to be the best Christmas of his life. And then, 5 minutes later, he was standing outside in the cold, holding my hand, watching the door close behind us. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was a mother trying to hold her family together with tape and hope. And what happened that night broke something in me that never fully went back to the way it was. But it also built something. Something stronger. Something that, 2 years later, would change everything. Let me take you back to where it started. Not that night, long before that night. Because to understand why 5 minutes at a dinner table could break a family apart, you have to understand the cracks that were already there, hiding under decades of holiday dinners and forced smiles. I grew up in a house where love had conditions. My parents weren't cruel people, not in the way you'd see in movies. They didn't yell, they didn't throw things. Their cruelty was quieter than that. It came in comparisons. In size. In the way my mother would look at my report card and say, "Your cousin got higher marks," instead of, "I'm proud of you." I remember being 8 years old, bringing home a drawing I'd made in art class, a lopsided sun, a house with too many windows, a family holding hands. I was so proud of it I could barely wait to get through the front door. My mother glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds before setting it on the counter and saying, "You should focus more on your handwriting homework." The drawing sat on that counter for 3 days before it quietly disappeared into the recycling. I never mentioned it again. I just learned, slowly, the way children learn everything that shapes them, not from one moment, but from 1,000 small moments like that one, that my worth in that house was something I had to earn, and even then, it was never guaranteed. I spent my whole childhood trying to earn a kind of love that was always just out of reach. Straight A's got a nod, not a hug. A piano recital got a comment about my posture, not my music. I learned to perform for approval instead of simply existing and being loved for it. By the time I was a teenager, I didn't even recognize the difference between the two anymore. When I got older, I told myself things would be different. I fell in love with a man named Daniel. He wasn't rich. He wasn't from the kind of family my parents approved of. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a school cafeteria worker, and Daniel himself worked with his hands, first in construction, later at a warehouse where he eventually became a shift supervisor. But he looked at me like I was enough, exactly as I was, without a single condition attached. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. I remember the first time he told me he loved me. We were sitting on the hood of his old car, parked at the edge of a field outside town, the kind of place with no streetlights, just stars. I'd made some offhand, self-deprecating joke about myself, the way I always did, deflecting before anyone else could criticize me first. And Daniel had just looked at me, quiet for a moment, and said, "You don't have to do that with me. I already love you. You don't have to convince me of anything." I cried that night. Not out of sadness, but because it was the first time in my entire life someone had loved me without asking for anything in return. My parents disapproved from the very beginning. "He has no ambition," my father said, the first time I brought Daniel home to meet them, even though Daniel had worked 2 jobs through his 20s to put himself through a trade certification program at night. "He'll never give you the life you deserve," my mother added, like she was reading from a script she'd been rehearsing for years, a script built entirely around the idea that love was a transaction, and Daniel simply didn't have enough currency to offer. I married him anyway. It was the first real act of rebellion in my life, and it felt like freedom. The wedding itself was small, a backyard, 40 folding chairs borrowed from Daniel's church, string lights his brother spent an entire Saturday hanging between 2 oak trees. I didn't have the wedding I'd once imagined as a little girl, the one with the string quartet and the ballroom my mother used to describe when she talked about her own wedding, as if planting the idea early enough would guarantee I'd want the same one. What I had instead was better, though it took me years to fully appreciate that. I had 30 people who actually wanted to be there. My parents were not among them. I'd sent the invitation 6 weeks in advance, a small, hopeful gesture I told myself wasn't really hope at all, just formality. 2 weeks before the wedding, I called to confirm details, timing, parking, whether my father wanted to say a few words. My mother's voice on the phone had been distant, clipped. "We'll see," she said, which I now understand, looking back, was never really a maybe. It was a no dressed up as a maybe, so she wouldn't have to be the one who said it outright. They didn't come. I stood at the altar, really just a wooden arch Daniel's father had built in his garage, and scanned the folding chairs one more time before the music started, some small, stubborn part of me still checking, still hoping. 2 empty chairs sat in the second row, the ones I'd reserved with little handwritten cards that said Mom and Dad in careful cursive. I remember Daniel noticing me looking at them, and without a word, he reached over and quietly turned both cards face down before the ceremony began, so I wouldn't have to keep seeing the names. That's the kind of man he was. He never once told me my parents were wrong for missing it, never used it as ammunition later in an argument the way some people might have. He just made the absence smaller, quietly, so it couldn't sit in the front row of my memory forever. My mother sent a card, 2 weeks late, with a check inside and no note, no congratulations, no, we're sorry we missed it, not even a signature beyond her name printed at the bottom, the same way she signed birthday cards to distant cousins. I kept the check uncashed in a drawer for almost a year, some strange, symbolic refusal to let that particular transaction close, to let money stand in for something that should have been so much simpler. 2 years later, our son was born. We named him Eli, after Daniel's grandfather. He had Daniel's eyes and my stubbornness, and from the moment I held him, still slick and screaming in that hospital room, I understood a love that had no conditions at all, a love that didn't care what he achieved, or how he behaved, or whether he made me proud. I loved him simply because he existed. I promised him, silently, holding his impossibly small hand in mine, that he would never feel what I felt growing up. He would never have to earn my love. It would just be his, always, unconditionally, the way it should have been for me. Life wasn't easy in those early years. Daniel worked long hours at the warehouse, and I picked up freelance graphic design work between diaper changes and bedtime stories, squeezing client calls into nap times and sending invoices at midnight after Eli finally fell asleep. We didn't have much, our apartment was small, our furniture secondhand, our car older than our marriage. But we had warmth. We had laughter in a small apartment that smelled like coffee and crayons and, on Sunday mornings, pancakes that Daniel always burned slightly on one side because he insisted on trying to flip them without a spatula. I remember those years now the way you remember a place you can never go back to, vivid, golden, aching. Daniel reading Eli the same 3 books every single night until he had them memorized and would correct Daniel if he skipped a page. Family walks to the park on Saturday mornings, Eli on Daniel's shoulders, pointing at every dog we passed like it was the first dog he'd ever seen. Small, unremarkable, perfect moments that I didn't yet know to treasure as much as I should have. Then, 3 years ago, Daniel got sick. It happened fast, the kind of fast that doesn't give you time to prepare, only time to grieve in advance. A persistent cough that didn't go away. A doctor's visit that turned into a specialist's visit that turned into words I still have trouble saying out loud even now. 6 months after his diagnosis, I was a widow, and Eli was fatherless at the age of 4. I won't pretend that grief didn't nearly destroy me. There were nights I sat on the bathroom floor after Eli fell asleep, the water running in the sink so he wouldn't hear me, crying in a way that felt less like sadness and more like something physically breaking inside my chest. There were mornings I stared at the ceiling for 20 minutes before I could convince my body to move, before I remembered that there was a small person down the hall who needed breakfast, who needed his mother to function even when functioning felt impossible. But mornings kept coming, and Eli needed me to keep coming with them. Grief, I learned, doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just happens alongside everything else, the laundry, the school pickups, the birthday parties you still have to smile through. My parents, to their credit, showed up during that time. Not with warmth, exactly, but with logistics. My mother helped with the funeral arrangements, efficient and composed in the way she handled everything. My father helped me sort through paperwork, insurance forms, Daniel's final paycheck, a mountain of administrative grief that no one warns you about. It was the closest thing to support I remembered getting from them since I was a child, and some small, hopeful, exhausted part of me thought, maybe this changes things. Maybe grief brought us closer. Maybe losing Daniel is the terrible price that finally buys us a real relationship. I was wrong. It hadn't changed the foundation. It had only paused it, the way a storm pauses before it comes back stronger. Because as the months passed, and Eli grew from a quiet, grieving 4-year-old into a curious, energetic 7-year-old, I started noticing something creeping back into every interaction. My parents' warmth toward him had a ceiling, and I could see it every time he brushed up against it. They loved the idea of a grandson, the photos on the mantle, the stories they could tell their friends at church. They struggled with the reality of a rowdy, imperfect little boy who spilled juice and asked too many questions and grieved his father in the unpredictable way children grieve, sometimes laughing minutes after crying, because that's simply how a child's heart processes loss, in waves instead of straight lines. He needs more discipline, my mother would say, watching Eli run circles around her living room, burning off energy the way any 7-year-old does. You're too soft with him, my father would add, shaking his head at some minor, forgivable mistake, a broken glass, an unfinished plate of vegetables, a moment of ordinary childhood chaos. I brushed it off as old habits. The same conditional love they'd given me, now aimed at my son, and I told myself I was strong enough now, as an adult, as a mother, to shield him from it in a way no one had shielded me. I told myself I was the wall between Eli and the coldness I grew up in, and that as long as I stood firm, he'd never really feel its chill. I was wrong about that too. You cannot fully shield a child from people who share your last name and your holiday table. Eventually, the wall has to hold against a direct hit. And that Christmas Eve, mine didn't hold in the way I thought it would. That Christmas, I let my guard down completely. They'd invited us for dinner weeks in advance. My mother had spent that time talking about it constantly, the china she was going to use, the good china, the ham she was going to make, how excited she was for the whole family to be together, for the first time in years. I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time around my parents, hope. Real, unguarded hope, the dangerous kind. Eli picked out his outfit himself, 3 days before the dinner. A green sweater with a reindeer stitched on the front that we'd found at a small shop downtown. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for 10 minutes on Christmas Eve, fixing his hair the way he'd seen Daniel do it in old photos, wetting it down and combing it to the side even though it never quite stayed. "Do I look good, Mom?" he asked me, turning to show me, and I told him he looked perfect, because he did. He looked like hope in a reindeer sweater. We arrived at 6. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted meat, candles burning on every surface. The table was set with the china my mother had been talking about for weeks, cloth napkins folded into little triangles at each place setting. For the first 30 minutes, everything felt normal. Almost good. My father asked Eli about school, actually listened to his answer about a science project on volcanoes. My mother complimented his sweater, said the green brought out his eyes. I remember thinking, watching them, maybe this really is different this time. Maybe we finally made it. But what I didn't know that evening, what I couldn't have known, sitting there with my guard finally, foolishly down, was that the calm was only the surface of something that had been building for a long time, pressure collecting behind a dam that had been cracking since before Eli was even born. And in the next few minutes, it would break wide open, and nothing about our family would ever look the same again. It started with spilled gravy. Eli reached for the bread basket and knocked his cup, and a small dark stain spread across my mother's white tablecloth. The one she'd told me, twice that evening alone, had belonged to her grandmother, had survived 2 moves and 40 years and was, in her words, irreplaceable. "Eli," I said gently, already reaching for a napkin, already moving into damage control the way I'd done 1,000 times as his mother, "it's okay, buddy, accidents happen." Let's clean it up. But my mother's face had already changed. I know that face. I grew up watching that face decide, in real time, whether I was worth patience or punishment, whether a mistake was forgivable or evidence of something deeper and worse. That tablecloth is an heirloom, she said, her voice flat and sharp, cutting clean through the warmth of 30 minutes earlier like it had never existed. I'm sorry, Eli said quietly, his small shoulders curling inward the way they did when he felt he'd done something unforgivable, when the air in a room suddenly told him he was in trouble before any words confirmed it. He looked at me, silently asking if he was in trouble, his eyes already glassy, and I squeezed his hand under the table, trying to tell him without words, "You're fine, you're safe, I've got you, this isn't the end of the world." I thought that was the end of it. Some spilled gravy, a stain that could be treated, a mild tension that would pass with a change of subject. I was wrong. My father, who had been quiet through the exchange, set down his fork with a deliberate click against the china, a sound designed to draw attention. "This is exactly what I mean," he said, not to Eli, but to me, like my son wasn't even sitting there between us, like he was a subject to be discussed rather than a child to be comforted. This is what happens when a child grows up without proper structure. Without a firm hand. The words landed like a slap, not just for what they said about Eli, but for what they implied about Daniel, about me, about the 4 years since we'd lost him. "He's 7, I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could, feeling my pulse start to climb. He knocked over a cup. "It's Christmas Eve. It's a tablecloth." "It's not about the cup," my mother said, folding her napkin with sharp, precise movements, not looking at me. "It's about respect. It's about a child who doesn't understand consequences because his mother lets everything slide. You've always been too permissive. Too soft. Just like you were as a child, when things weren't handled properly. When things weren't handled properly. As if my childhood, the strict report card scrutiny and the withheld affection, had been some kind of missed opportunity for even more discipline, rather than the source of every insecurity I'd spent my adult life trying to unlearn. I felt heat rising in my chest, the old, familiar heat of being 16 again, defending a mediocre grade, defending a friendship they didn't approve of, defending myself at this exact table under this exact chandelier. Except this time, it wasn't me being picked apart in that clinical, disappointed tone. It was my son. And something about that changed the entire equation, lit something in me that had never quite been lit on my own behalf. "Don't talk about him like that," I said, my voice lower now, harder. "Not tonight. Not ever." That should have been where it ended. A tense moment, an apology, a shift to a different topic, the way most families manage to survive a holiday dinner through sheer avoidance. But my mother wasn't finished. I realize now, looking back, that she'd been waiting for a long time for a moment exactly like this one, a small, forgivable mistake she could inflate into justification for something much bigger. She turned to Eli directly, and her voice took on the tone I remembered from childhood punishments, calm, cold, and final, the tone that meant discussion was over before it had even really begun. "Eli," she said, "because of what you did, I think it's best if you and your mother leave." The table went silent. Even the candles seemed to hold still. "Excuse me?" I said, certain, for one disoriented second, that I'd misheard her. "You heard me," she said, not even looking at me now, still looking directly at my 7-year-old son with an expression I can only describe as disappointment aimed at a child who had done nothing but be a child. "Leave, and never come back to my house again. I want you to understand something it took me weeks afterward to fully piece together." My mother was not talking about that single night, not really. I could see it in her eyes as she said it, the finality, the years of built-up resentment toward the life I'd chosen, toward Daniel, toward the version of me that hadn't turned out the way she wanted, toward a grandson who reminded her, every time she looked at him, of a daughter who had defied her and a son-in-law she'd never approved of and never had to fully forgive because he'd died before she'd been forced to. She was using my son, a 7-year-old boy who had just lost his father 3 years earlier, as the excuse to finally end something she had wanted to end for a long, long time, and had simply been waiting for permission to do out loud. Eli's face crumpled. He didn't understand adult cruelty yet, didn't have the framework to recognize when he was being used as a weapon in a war that had started decades before he was born. All he understood was that his grandmother, at Christmas, in front of everyone, in front of the ham that wasn't even cut yet, had just told him he wasn't welcome. His lip trembled, that particular tremble that precedes real tears in small children, and he looked at me with wide, wet eyes and asked, so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the ringing in my own ears, "Did I do something really bad, Mom?" Something in me went very still. Very cold. Very clear, in a way I can only describe as the moment fog lifts and you finally see the shape of something that had been standing in front of you your whole life. "No, baby," I said, standing up and taking his hand, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood in the silence. "You didn't do anything wrong. Get your coat." My father tried to interject, some half-hearted, conflict-averse, "Let's not overreact, let's all just calm down," the same tone he'd used my entire childhood to smooth over my mother's sharpest edges without ever actually challenging them. But I wasn't listening anymore. I helped Eli into his coat with hands that were shaking, not from fear, but from a fury I had never fully let myself feel toward my parents before, not even as a teenager, not even at my own wedding when they hadn't shown up. Years of swallowed hurt, decades of small comparisons and withheld affection, rising up all at once and finding, finally, a target worth fighting for, not myself, but my son. At the door, my mother said one more thing, the sentence that would replay in my head for months afterward, on sleepless nights and in quiet moments driving to school pickup, "You always did make things harder than they needed to be." I looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time as an adult and not as her daughter, not as the little girl still hoping for a hug over a report card. And I said, "No. You made things harder. You've been doing it my whole life. I just finally see it clearly." We walked out into the cold. Eli was crying softly, confused, holding my hand so tight it almost hurt, his small breath fogging in the freezing December air. The Christmas lights on the neighbors' houses blurred through my own tears as we walked to the car, red and green smearing together like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine, watching my breath fog the windshield, feeling my son's small sobs beside me, feeling the weight of a decision I hadn't fully made yet but could already feel taking shape. "Mom," he said eventually, his voice small and cracked, "are we in trouble?" I turned to him, and I made a decision in that moment that would define the next chapter of both our lives, a decision that felt less like a choice and more like something finally settling into place after years of resisting it. "No," I said, reaching over to wipe a tear from his cheek with my thumb. "We're free." I didn't fully understand what I meant by that yet, not completely. But something had cracked open in me, the last thread connecting me to the idea that my parents' approval was something I still needed, something worth bending myself out of shape to earn. Watching them do to my son exactly what they'd done to me for 30 years, watching the pattern repeat itself in real time on the one person I would burn the world down to protect, I finally understood, this wasn't a pattern I could fix by trying harder, by being a better daughter, by bringing a more careful, well-behaved version of my family to the next dinner. It was a pattern I had to walk away from completely, the way you walk away from a house that's already on fire instead of trying to save the furniture inside. That night, after Eli finally cried himself to sleep in my arms on the living room couch, both of us still in our Christmas clothes, too exhausted to change, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me and made a promise. Not a promise of revenge in the way movies show it, no scheming, no plotting to destroy anyone, no grand speech I was rehearsing for a future confrontation. My promise was simpler and, in some ways, more powerful. I would build a life so full, so stable, so warm, that my son would never again wonder, even for a second, if he was worth loving. I didn't know yet that life had its own way of settling scores, quietly, without my help. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life, not because of what my parents had done, exactly, but because of the silence afterward. No apology came. No phone call, no card, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had even happened. It was as if the years of my life, and my son's entire existence, could be erased with a locked door and a cold sentence, filed away and forgotten the way you'd forget a minor inconvenience. Christmas Day itself was quiet. I'd already planned a small celebration for just the two of us regardless of the dinner, but it felt different now, hollowed out at the edges. Eli opened his presents with less enthusiasm than usual, kept glancing at me like he was checking whether it was safe to be happy. I made pancakes, slightly burned on one side, the way Daniel used to make them, and told Eli it was because I was keeping the tradition of bad pancake flipping alive in his honor, and for the first time since we'd walked out of my parents' house, I heard my son really laugh. But the days after Christmas were harder than Christmas Day itself, in the way that grief often is, not the sharp moment of loss, but the long, dull stretch afterward where you have to keep living inside the new shape of things. Eli went back to school in early January, and his teacher called me the second week back, gently concerned, saying he'd seemed withdrawn, had snapped at a classmate over something small, had put his head down on his desk during free reading time more than once. I sat in my car in the school parking lot after that call for a long time before I could make myself drive home, feeling the particular helplessness of watching your child carry a wound you can't kiss better, can't bandage, can't fix with a hug and a band-aid the way you could when he was smaller. That night, I sat on the edge of his bed after his light was supposed to be off and asked him, gently, if he wanted to talk about it. He was quiet for a long time, tracing a seam on his comforter with one finger, and then he asked the question that broke something open in me all over again: why doesn't Grandma like me? I chose my words as carefully as I've ever chosen anything in my life. It's not about you, baby. I promise you, it was never about you. Some grown-ups carry old hurts inside them for so long that they don't know how to love people without hurting them a little too. That's not something you did. That's something inside her, something she has to work on, if she ever decides to. But you love me and you don't hurt me, he said, with the simple, devastating logic of a 7-year-old. That's because I decided a long time ago that I was never going to let anything I carry get in the way of loving you all the way, no conditions, I told him. That's a choice, Eli. Some people make it. Some people don't. It's not about whether a kid deserves it. Every kid deserves it. It's about whether the grown-up is brave enough to choose it. He thought about that for a while, and then he said, I'm gonna choose it too. When I'm a grown-up. And he rolled over and went to sleep, and I sat there in the dark of his room for a long time afterward, crying quietly, not from sadness this time, but from something fierce and proud and entirely new, the feeling of watching your child understand, at 7 years old, something it had taken his mother 3 decades to learn. That laugh became something I chased deliberately in the weeks after. Not to distract from what happened, but to prove to both of us that joy hadn't left with the slammed door. But grief, even old grief, even grief for a relationship that had never really been what I needed it to be, has a strange gift sometimes. It clears out everything that isn't essential. I stopped waiting for my parents to change. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head where they finally understood, finally apologized, finally loved us the way I'd always hoped they would. I redirected all of that mental and emotional energy into Eli, and, without meaning to, into myself, into a version of myself I hadn't had the space to build while I was still trying to earn approval from people who had already decided, long ago, exactly how much of me they were willing to accept. I picked up more freelance work I'd been too cautious to pursue before. I said yes to bigger projects I would have once been too afraid to take, projects that required me to negotiate rates I didn't feel entirely confident asking for, projects that pushed my skills further than they'd ever been pushed. I enrolled in an evening course to sharpen skills I'd let go stagnant during years of grief and caretaking, sitting in the back of a community college classroom twice a week, Eli doing homework beside me at a shared table, both of us learning at the same time, in the same room, like tiny mirrors of each other. Every late night at my laptop, every rejected pitch that stung less each time, every small win, a new client, a referral, a project that actually turned a profit, I did it with one thought quietly running underneath everything: we don't need them. We are enough, exactly as we are, on our own. Eli, in his own quiet way, started healing too. He stopped asking about his grandparents after a few months, stopped bringing up the dinner unprompted, though I noticed, for a long time afterward, a slight hesitation whenever spilled milk or a small accident happened, a flinch that told me the wound was healing slower than his words let on. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, especially when the adults around them stay steady, but resilience isn't the same as immunity, and I made sure I noticed every flinch, every hesitation, and met it with the same quiet reassurance every time. You are not in trouble. You are safe. You are loved without conditions. I made sure I stayed steady, even on the nights it cost me everything I had left, even on the nights I cried in the shower where Eli couldn't hear, the water running long after I'd stopped actually washing anything. Slowly, without me even noticing the exact moment it happened, surviving turned into building. The distinction mattered more than I expected. Surviving is reactive, you're just trying to make it to the next day intact. Building is different. Building means you've started imagining a future worth working toward, instead of just enduring a present you're trying to escape. There's a particular afternoon from that first year I still think about often. I'd been asked to pitch a rebrand for a local bakery chain, small potatoes, honestly, compared to what would come later, but at the time it felt enormous. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night, Eli long asleep, 3 different logo concepts spread out in front of me, second-guessing every choice, my old habit of needing someone else's approval before I trusted my own judgment rearing its head even here, in a decision that had nothing to do with my parents at all. I caught myself doing it, reaching for my phone to send a photo of the concepts to my mother, an old reflex, wanting her opinion before I moved forward with anything important, wanting the validation I'd spent my whole life chasing. I stopped with my thumb over her contact name. And then, for the first time, I deliberately put the phone face down on the table, looked at the 3 logo concepts again with just my own eyes, and picked the one I actually liked best. Not the safest one. Not the one I imagined she'd approve of. The one that felt right to me. I got the contract. It was a small thing, in the grand scheme of everything that followed, but it taught me something larger than the bakery deal itself. I could trust my own judgment. I didn't need anyone's permission to know what was good. Eli had his own version of that lesson happening in parallel, though I didn't fully appreciate it until much later. He'd made a friend at school named Marcus, a quiet, freckled boy who lived 2 streets over, and the 2 of them became inseparable within weeks, building blanket forts, trading baseball cards, riding bikes up and down our block until the streetlights came on. Marcus's family was warm in the uncomplicated way I'd always secretly envied in other people's families, the kind of warmth that didn't come with fine print. Marcus's mother, a woman named Priya, became something like a lifeline for me during that first year, the 2 of us trading school pickups, trading casseroles on hard weeks, trading the kind of unguarded friendship I hadn't let myself have in years because I'd spent so long protecting myself from people who might, eventually, turn out to have conditions of their own. One evening, watching Eli and Marcus build an elaborate cardboard spaceship in Priya's garage, arguing happily over whose turn it was to be captain, Priya turned to me and said, without any particular weight behind it, just an observation, "He's a really happy kid, you know. You should be proud of that." It was such a small thing to say. But I drove home that night crying, not from sadness, but because someone had finally said the thing about my parenting that I'd never once heard from my own mother, not, "He needs more discipline," not, "You're too soft," just, simply, "He's happy, and you did that." By the second year, the studio had grown enough that I hired my first employee, a recent design graduate named Theo who was talented and anxious and reminded me, in a strange way, of myself at that age, capable, but not yet sure he was allowed to take up space. I found myself, in training him, saying things I wished someone had said to me at his age. Trust your instinct here. You don't need to apologize for having an opinion in this meeting. That was good work, I mean that. I watched him grow more confident over the following months, and there was something quietly healing in giving someone else the kind of unconditional encouragement I'd spent my whole life waiting to receive. Eli's baseball season that spring gave me another one of those small, cumulative moments that I didn't recognize as significant until much later. He'd struck out 3 times in a row during a game, badly, visibly frustrated, kicking at the dirt on his way back to the dugout with his shoulders hunched in a way that looked painfully familiar, that same posture he'd had walking out of my parents' house 2 years earlier. I crouched down next to the dugout fence between innings and told him, "I don't care about the strikeouts. I care that you got back up there and swung anyway. That's the whole game, buddy. That's the whole thing." He looked at me for a long moment, like he was checking whether I meant it, the way he still sometimes did, and then he nodded, and in the bottom of the 5th inning, He hit a double down the left field line and looked straight at me in the stands before he even reached second base. I didn't cry at the game. I cried in the car afterward, alone for the 30 seconds it took Eli to grab his glove from the dugout, because I understood, watching him run the bases with his whole small body full of joy and no fear of getting it wrong, that I had actually done it. I had built the thing I promised him in that hospital room the day he was born. He didn't have to earn my love with a hit or lose it with a strikeout. He already knew, somewhere in his bones, that both things were fine. 2 years passed. In that time, my freelance design work grew into something I hadn't dared to imagine, a small studio with 3 other designers, built from nothing but stubbornness, late nights, and the particular kind of resolve that only comes from having something worth protecting. We landed a contract with a regional retail chain that changed everything financially, a contract I almost didn't pursue because the pitch deadline fell on Eli's school play and I nearly let the opportunity pass rather than miss it. I stayed up until 3 a.m. 2 nights in a row finishing the proposal after Eli's play, refusing to choose between the 2 things I was building, his childhood and my future. For the first time since Daniel passed, I wasn't just surviving month to month, counting down the days until the next invoice cleared. I was stable. I hired an office manager. I signed a 2-year lease on a small studio space downtown, painted the walls myself over a weekend with Eli, helping, by painting increasingly elaborate murals on a scrap piece of drywall in the corner. By any reasonable definition, I was thriving. Eli was 9 now, taller, more confident, still carrying his father's eyes but now carrying something else too, a steadiness that I like to believe came from watching his mother rebuild a life out of the wreckage of a broken Christmas Eve. He'd joined a youth baseball league. He had a best friend named Marcus who came over most weekends. He talked about his father openly now, not with the raw grief of his younger years, but with a kind of easy affection, telling stories about Daniel he was too young to have actually remembered clearly, stories I suspect he'd built partly from photographs and partly from the way I talked about him, but that felt true regardless, because that's what memory does for the people we love. It keeps building itself, brick by brick, long after the person is gone. I want to be clear about something, because this is where a lot of these stories tend to exaggerate the truth for the sake of drama. My revenge was never a plan. I never set out to make my parents pay, never plotted some dramatic downfall for them, never fantasized about a moment where they'd see my success and regret every word they'd said. What happened instead was something quieter, and in a way, more honest. I simply stopped orbiting around their approval, and my life, freed from that gravity, finally had room to grow in directions I couldn't have predicted. But karma, as it turns out, doesn't need my help to keep score. It was a Tuesday afternoon, an ordinary day, sunlight coming through the studio windows, when I got the call. My father's number, which I hadn't seen light up my phone in almost 2 years, flashing on the screen while I was in the middle of reviewing a client's logo revisions. My hand hovered over the screen for a long moment before I answered, my stomach already tightening with the particular dread that only a parent's unexpected call can bring. Hello? My mother's voice, thinner than I remembered, shakier, came through the line, stripped of the composure I'd always associated with her. Your father had a heart attack, she said. He's stable, but we don't have anyone else to call. I sat with that sentence for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. We don't have anyone else to call. Not, we miss you. Not, we're sorry. Not even, please come. Just a fact, delivered out of raw necessity, from 2 people who had built a life so isolated by their own conditions and coldness, alienated from extended family through decades of the same behavior they'd shown me, distant from neighbors who'd stopped trying after being rebuffed too many times, that when an emergency came, their own daughter, the one they'd told to leave and never return, was the only name left in the contacts list worth trying. I could have said no. Some part of me, the part still healing from that Christmas Eve, the part that remembered exactly how it felt standing outside that door in the cold with a crying 7-year-old, wanted to say no, wanted to let the silence of the last 2 years finally speak for itself. But I am not my parents. That was the whole point of everything I had rebuilt over the last 2 years. Cutting them off from my life had never been about cruelty in return for cruelty. It had been about protecting Eli, about protecting myself, about refusing to keep paying an emotional price that never bought me anything real. This was different. This was a human being, my father, in a hospital bed, and whatever complicated history stood between us, I wasn't willing to let him face it without anyone in the room who loved him. I drove to the hospital that afternoon, leaving the studio in the hands of my staff for the first time without a second thought about whether things would fall apart without me, a small, unrelated proof of how far I'd come. I sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, scrolling through nothing on my phone, watching the clock, feeling old anxieties I thought I'd outgrown creeping back in. When my mother saw me walk in, something in her face broke, not into an apology, not yet, but into an expression I hadn't seen on her since I was a very young child, before all the conditions had calcified into her default setting, fear, and beneath it, a raw, unguarded need that she clearly hated feeling in front of me. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice unsteady. I didn't say, "Of course," or, "I love you, Mom," the things a different kind of daughter might have said in that moment. I simply nodded and asked, "How is he?" My father recovered, slowly, over the following weeks. Bypass surgery, a difficult recovery, a long list of new medications and dietary restrictions he grumbled about constantly, which I took as a good sign. He was well enough to complain, which felt like its own kind of small miracle. In the weeks that followed, as I helped coordinate his care because there truly was no one else, driving my mother to appointments, sitting with her in waiting rooms, calling the pharmacy to sort out insurance confusion, my mother and I had the first honest conversation of our entire relationship. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't a movie-perfect reconciliation with swelling music and open arms. It happened in fragments, scattered across weeks, in a hospital cafeteria over bad coffee, in her kitchen while I made her tea because her hands were shaking too much to do it herself, in long silences in the car that finally didn't feel like punishments, just like two people sitting with a lot of history between them, trying to figure out what, if anything, could still be salvaged. "I was wrong," she said to me one evening, not looking at me, staring instead at her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. "About Daniel. About Eli. About a lot of things, I think. Maybe most things." I didn't rush to forgive her. I want to be honest about that too, because that's part of what I learned through all of this. Healing doesn't mean pretending the wound never happened, doesn't mean rushing toward a reconciliation just because it would tie the story up neatly. It means choosing, deliberately and slowly, what role that wound gets to play in your future, and refusing to let anyone rush you into a forgiveness you haven't actually finished earning your way toward, even if you're the one who has to do the earning of your own peace. "You hurt him," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You hurt a 7-year-old who had already lost his father. In front of everyone. On Christmas. That's not something I can just erase because Dad had a heart attack and you finally noticed we exist." "I know," she said, and for the first time in my entire life, I believed she actually meant it, not as a strategic apology to smooth things over, but as something that had genuinely cracked open in her during those long, frightening hours in the hospital waiting room, staring down the possibility of losing her husband and realizing exactly how small her world had become. I didn't bring Eli back into their lives right away. That decision, I decided firmly, was his to make, not mine, once he was old enough to fully understand it and choose it for himself rather than having it imposed on him a second time by adults making decisions about his life without his input. What I did instead was set boundaries, real ones, not the desperate, hopeful half-boundaries I'd tried to set as a younger woman still starving for her parents' love and terrified of losing even the conditional version of it. I told my mother and father plainly, in a conversation that took place in their living room on a Sunday afternoon, that if they wanted any place in our lives going forward, it would be on our terms, built slowly, built on demonstrated actions instead of apologies spoken under the pressure of a hospital room. "If you want a relationship with Eli," I told them, "it has to be earned. Slowly. And the first time either of you speaks to him the way you did that night, it's over. Permanently. No second chances after that." My father, still weak from surgery, nodded without argument. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded too. To their credit, over the following year, they tried, and I watched carefully, skeptically at first, for any sign of the old patterns creeping back in. Small things at first, a birthday card for Eli with an actual, specific memory written inside instead of a generic message, mentioning a story about the science project he'd talked about at that fateful Christmas dinner, proof my mother had actually been listening even in the middle of everything else that went wrong that night. My father showing up, uninvited but not unwelcome, to fix a leaking faucet in my apartment on a Saturday morning, and staying just long enough afterward to ask Eli about his baseball team, and actually listening to the answer, asking follow-up questions, remembering details the next time he visited. The first time I let Eli see them again, nearly a year after the hospital call, I sat down with him beforehand and asked him honestly if he wanted to. He thought about it for a long moment, chewing his lip the way he did when he was working through something serious, and said, "Can we try it just once and see?" That felt like the right amount of caution for a 10-year-old who'd learned, far too early, that trust isn't something you hand out freely just because someone shares your blood. That first visit was careful, a little stiff, everyone on their best behavior in a way that felt almost formal. I remember sitting in my car outside their house for a full minute before going in, going over the plan with Eli one more time. If anything felt wrong, even a little wrong, we would leave immediately, no explanations required, no guilt about it. He nodded seriously, like a soldier receiving orders, and that image, my 10-year-old son needing a safety plan to visit his own grandparents, was its own quiet reminder of exactly why the caution mattered. My mother had made cookies, and this time, when Eli reached for one and nearly knocked over his glass of milk in the process, she simply reached out and steadied it herself, laughing it off, saying, "Careful there, buddy," in a tone so different from that Christmas Eve that I had to look away for a second to keep my composure. My father showed Eli the scar from his surgery, turning it into something almost like an adventure story. The doctors opened me right up, like a car hood, and Eli listened with the wide-eyed fascination only a 10-year-old boy can have for something slightly gruesome, asking follow-up questions about staples and stitches until my mother told them both, with real warmth in her voice, that it wasn't proper table conversation, but she was smiling when she said it. We kept the visits short at first, an hour, then 2, always with an easy exit built in, always with a debrief afterward where I'd ask Eli how he felt, really felt, not just what he thought I wanted to hear. For months, he'd answer honestly, "It was okay. Grandpa's funny now." Or, once, more hesitantly, "Grandma got kind of quiet when I asked for more juice." Like she wanted to say something but didn't. I paid attention to every one of those small reports, because I'd promised myself I would never again let a warning sign pass by unexamined the way I had that Christmas Eve, when 30 minutes of pleasant conversation had lulled me into believing the pattern was gone rather than just paused. There was one visit, about 8 months in, that tested everything we'd rebuilt. Eli had brought a school assignment to show them, a short essay about someone he admired, and he'd chosen to write about his father. He read it aloud at their kitchen table, this careful, earnest piece about a man he barely remembered in full, stitched together from photographs and stories and his own imagination filling in the gaps. I watched my mother's face while he read, braced for the flicker of disapproval I still, even then, half expected to surface, some comment about Daniel, some old resentment finding its way out. Instead, when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your father was a good man, Eli." I didn't always show that I believed that. But I did believe it. I just didn't say it enough, to him or to your mother. It was the closest thing to a direct apology about Daniel that I'd ever heard from her, and it came not to me, but to my son, in a kitchen, over a school essay, for years after Daniel had died. I excused myself to the bathroom for a few minutes after that, needing space to process feeling something I hadn't expected, not forgiveness, exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Relief, maybe. Or the first real evidence that the person apologizing understood what she was apologizing for. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Some wounds from childhood don't fully close, they just stop bleeding, scar over, become something you carry rather than something that actively hurts every single day. There are still moments, even now, where I catch a flicker of the old coldness in my mother's voice, a sharpness aimed at some minor thing, and I watch it closely, ready to shut it down the moment it aims itself at my son again. But somewhere in the space between the Christmas Eve when they told my son to leave and never return, and the 2 years that followed, something in our family finally became honest for the first time in my entire life, even if honest didn't always mean comfortable. The real justice, though, wasn't in my parents' apology, wasn't in the hospital call or the careful reconciliation that followed. It was in what I built while I wasn't waiting for one. It was in the studio with my name on the lease. It was in the stability I gave Eli, the kind that didn't depend on anyone else's approval to exist. It was in watching my son grow into a boy who understood his own worth without needing anyone to grant it to him first. Eli is 11 now. He plays baseball, he's the starting shortstop on his team, a fact he reminds me of often and with great pride. He still wears his father's old watch, far too big for his wrist, on special occasions, the leather band wrapped an extra loop around to keep it from sliding off. He knows the story of that Christmas Eve now, not every painful detail, but enough, told to him carefully, honestly, without either villainizing his grandparents beyond what was fair or minimizing what they'd done to make it easier to swallow. When I asked him once, gently, sitting on the edge of his bed after a visit to my parents' house, if he wanted to keep seeing them, keep giving them chances, he thought about it seriously, the way he thinks about everything, his 11-year-old brow furrowed in genuine consideration, and said, "I think people can be sorry and still have to earn trust back. Both things can be true at the same time." 11 years old, and he already understood something it took me 30 years, and one terrible Christmas Eve, to finally learn. If there's a lesson in this story, it isn't about revenge in the way we usually think of it. No downfall, no dramatic collapse, no villain getting publicly humiliated, no moment of loud, satisfying justice that ties everything up with a bow. The real justice was quieter than that, and in some ways, harder one. It was a woman who used to believe her worth depended entirely on her parents' approval, learning instead, slowly and painfully and then eventually joyfully, to build a life so solid, so warm, so full of unconditional love, that the people who once tried to make her feel small became, in the end, the ones standing outside, hoping to be let back in. My mother's words that Christmas Eve were meant to break something in my son. Instead, they broke something in me, the last illusion that I needed anyone's permission to be enough, the last thread tying my sense of worth to two people who had never quite figured out how to give love without conditions attached. We don't need every door that closes on us to open again. Sometimes the greatest justice is simply becoming someone who no longer needs it to, someone whose life is full enough, on its own terms, that a locked door is just a locked door, and not a verdict on your worth. And that Christmas Eve, when they told my son to leave and never return, I didn't know it yet, but they weren't ending our story. They were finally letting us begin it.